Velkomin á Málstofu. Ánægja að kynna söguna Tombari á Norður heimskjöldsráðinu. Hann framkvæmdastjóri vinnuhóps þar. Hann ætlar að flytja okkur erindi varðveislu á Fauna og
Takk hérlega. Eins og Björn sagði, ég heiti Tom Barry. Ég ætla bara að samtala á ensku, ég lenda alltaf vandaryfirinn að tólka vísindi tugtokk yfir á íslenska. Það endast mjög illa. So my name is Tom. I live in Akureyri and I'm Irish, so I'm footing two worlds. But I work with one of the Arctic Council working groups. Strange as it might sound, Akureyri is, outside of Norway, the largest centre for Arctic science policy work within the Arctic Council. So we have two working groups located there. The conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, or CAFF, where I work, and the protection of the Arctic marine environment, or PAIM. And I'm trying to speak slowly because I've just come from Ireland, and where I live in Ireland, people talk really quick, so I'm always warned to slow down. So I was going to talk just a little bit about what CAFF is. So within the Arctic Council you have 6 working groups. Each deals with a different thematic area. CAFF is a group that deals with biodiversity, and our role really is to communicate information from scientists and transform it into a manner that decision makers or policy makers or politicians can better understand. Or as some might say, we try and simplify it so people who don't understand it can understand what we're talking about. Within the Arctic Council, the chairmanship of the Arctic Council rotates every 2 years. So Iceland is due to take chairmanship of the Arctic Council now in May 2019. And when they do take that chairmanship role, it'll be the biggest foreign policy effort that Iceland has made to date in its history. So you're going to, from this point onwards, probably hear a lot more about Arctic issues within Iceland and questions as to how your work and how your institute relates to Arctic issues and what you might be able to do during Iceland's chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Within the Arctic Council, there's different institutes represent each country on the board of the various different working groups. And with regards to Iceland, it's not the Freshwater or Trausti Baldursson who represents Iceland. So he's my communication point into the Icelandic system. So CAFF has a whole broad range of activities. We conduct monitoring on what's happening with biodiversity in the Arctic. We conduct assessments based on the information that flows from the monitoring programs. And based upon this information, then we develop recommendations for policy and science that are delivered to the Arctic states through the Arctic Council. And then we try and communicate that information out both to the public as well. There's a whole range of activities that CAFF undertakes. Here in Akureyri, we're just 5 people located in Akureyri in our office, but there's a whole range of science groups located under that secretariat which work on monitoring and assessment. So there's an awful lot of different activities that are relevant for your institute. But today I'm just going to focus on 2 of them. But before I do so, I'll just talk very briefly about what I mean by the Arctic when I talk about the Arctic. Because most people in Iceland don't think of Iceland as an Arctic state, whereas it's very much a key player within the Arctic Council. So this red line that you show here, that delimitates or demarks the area within which CAFF operates. So as you can see, it's a huge area. We're not just talking about the high Arctic. It even drops down to incorporate the Faroe Islands in a strange loop there. This area is about 32 million square kilometers. About 53% of it is ocean and the rest is land. So even though within the Arctic world you most often hear about marine issues, there's also an enormous amount of work within the Arctic Council with regards to freshwater and terrestrial biodiversity and climate change issues. So the challenge that we face within this huge area is that we've got limited resources. It's a remote area. How do we better coordinate our knowledge and our capacity to try and help us more effectively deliver tools and information and advice to the Arctic states so that decision makers and policy makers can make more informed decisions when they're looking at what happens across the Arctic. What I'm going to talk briefly about today, because we just have a very short time, is are two aspects of CAFF's work, and that's the freshwater and marine biodiversity monitoring programs. So one of the Arctic Council's ways to respond to this challenge of how we better coordinate our work across the Arctic is the implementation of what's known as the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. So this is an ecosystem-based monitoring program. It looks at freshwater, terrestrial, marine and coastal ecosystems. And behind each of these different systems lies a monitoring plan that's been developed over several years to try and find agreement on how we harmonise and compile and coordinate existing monitoring activity across the Arctic. So far we have completed and are implementing the freshwater, terrestrial and marine monitoring plans, and the coastal one, which is more challenging, is underway because that's where the majority of people live and an awful lot of the pressures and dramas associated with climate change actually occur in a real visible way. So with regards to the marine biodiversity monitoring plan, what this consists of is an agreement across the Arctic states on how they should harmonise, standardise and coordinate collection and synthesising of their monitoring information. It is underpinned by a framework of 6 expert monitoring groups. We have seabirds, plankton, biota, benthos and marine mammals, and plankton of course. And what we've done through this monitoring plan, and the same is true for each of the other monitoring plans, is we've identified a whole range of what we call focal ecosystem components. And in the case of the marine plan, these are the consensus on what are key elements of the Arctic marine ecosystem. So there was a multi-year process to try and agree between all the Arctic states what are these key components of the ecosystem that if there's a change in them, it means that it signifies something greater and that we therefore need to monitor and track. So these 6 expert groups spent the last couple of years trying to collect and harmonise how information is collected on these ecosystem components. And they just completed that process now earlier this year. And in order to report and coordinate how we give information about this out, we've also identified a series of 8 what we call Arctic marine areas, which were agreed upon as being distinct physically and biochemically. And this all resulted in the release earlier this year of this report, which is the first integrated report from the Arctic Council on the state of the Arctic's marine ecosystem report, or biodiversity, and also then a whole range of advice for policymakers and how to better coordinate monitoring. And while all of this information, advice and key findings that comes with these assessments is very important, for me the key result of all this work is not so much the science findings, although they're important. It's more that we now have in place for the marine ecosystem a framework that allows us to coordinate our reporting. For example, this diagram here represents the status of monitoring as of May this year with regards to the marine ecosystem. Each segment represents a specific Arctic marine area, and each ring represents a specific group of species. And under each of those species groups are a whole range then of these focal ecosystem components that we've identified. And then we've given it a color coordinated system where you can see if monitoring is good, if there's no monitoring taking place. For example, here you can see when we're looking at fishes in the Atlantic Arctic, the consensus is that monitoring is good, whereas in the Hudson complex there's none or the sporadic monitoring taking place. And you can the Arctic Council talks an awful lot about coordinating in the Arctic states, how they present information and how they work with it. But this is the first time that they've managed to come together with a very visual framework that can use, that can serve both as a planning tool for decision making, but also for planning and coordinating where states put their research funding, where they decide what the gaps in knowledge are and how they can work on these issues. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to stop me. So, to me, this is the key achievement of this particular report, is this framework. So we can now start to see very quickly and easily where we need to focus our attention. And of course, this is only built upon the knowledge we were able to compile for this report. And there may be gaps in that knowledge that we will then repeat on an annual basis and try and update. For example, it's often quite challenging to get information on Russian areas. So you see here in the Karalaptev area, you just have no monitoring taking place as far as we're aware. But there may well be monitoring and activities taking place that we just were unable to access or were unaware of. And that's okay too, because that's a good result. It means that we can then focus on those areas and discuss with our Russian colleagues, what are we missing, where are there gaps in our knowledge, and can we access that information? What lies behind that status of monitoring graph then are a whole series of comparable graphs, one for each of those species groups. This particular one deals with trends in marine mammals. And here again, you can see whether the trends for marine mammals in the different groups are decreasing, whether they're unknown. And you can see there's an awful lot of unknowns here. And when there's a white line, it means that particular focal ecosystem component is not present in that Arctic marine area. And the uses of this are very handy. For example, you can see here, this deals with bowhead whales. And you can see that in 5 of the 6 Arctic marine areas where bowhead whales are recorded as being present, their numbers are increasing. And that leads you to the question, why? Is it because of changes in harvesting practices? So it means that they're allowed to sort of rebound, or is it due to climate change issues? But it automatically helps people who are not biologists or not scientists to start to understand how we can better respond accordingly. And these tools now are just released in May, but they're starting to be taken up. So we're getting interest from places as far afield as the Falkland Islands. Only earlier this summer now we're in contact because they want to build up a marine biodiversity monitoring program, and they're looking at something, or looking for examples that they can use to sort of mirror their work. Because the Arctic is unique in the sense that it's one of those areas where there, despite all of the different things going on in the world, there is great cooperation between all the Arctic states, from the US, Russia, Canada, and so on. So it's one area where science cooperation is flourishing. So that's one of the plans that we have just released that report, and I'll leave some copies here if anyone wants to take them to read. So we're in the process of replicating that work in each of the other ecosystem groups as well. And where Havro, or Havovat, although when I look at the website it's just totally marine areas at the moment, is Gudne is the representative on that group for Iceland. So that's a process that's currently underway, and as with the marine monitoring plan, this group has spent several years agreeing upon an Arctic biodiversity freshwater monitoring plan, where they agreed upon how to compile and harmonize information on freshwater biodiversity across the Arctic. And they have these different groups where they've identified focal ecosystem components, fish, macrovites, various planktons, benthic algae. And please correct me if I miss anything. And the interesting thing about this particular plan is the marine plan was the first report to be released or to be addressed. And with each successive report, we're learning better how we can try and make that information more integrated and accessible. So what's nice about the freshwater report is that in addition to the report itself, there's going to be a very comprehensive integrated data set that will follow that report. So you'll have the report, but you'll also have a very clear digital baseline that follows that report. So that when it comes to updating or using that information for other things, that information will be readily available for people to use and access. Because one of the challenges in the Arctic, of course, is that an awful lot of effort goes into these huge sort of assessments. And once those assessments are completed, that work stops and you have to start up again next time around. And that's the advantage of this monitoring program that we're building up, is that it allows this information to be repeated on a regular basis. So the freshwater integrated report on freshwater biodiversity is due to be completed sometime in 2018 or probably early 2019. It's going to consist of a range of regional and circumpolar assessments of the state of biodiversity in the freshwater ecosystems. It'll be accompanied by a special issue of freshwater biology, because what we're trying to do as well is ensure that the scientists who participate in all of this work, many of them do so on a voluntary basis, also find some value in it for their work and within their systems as well. And of course, I like this best of all, that there's going to be this very nice, clear database that we can use for future iterations of this work. an underlying focus for CAFF's work as well is that we want to ensure that all of this information that we collect from across the states is available for other people to use, that it doesn't just disappear into a large PDF and printed copy once it comes out. So we've established what we call the Arctic Biodiversity Database, or the ABDS, and this is the intention being that each time we release such a report, that all the data collected for that report is made available on that database or data service, and that then in turn has been recognized as the Arctic node for a range of different global warehouses. For example, the UNESCO's Ocean Biographic Information System, which I assume Havro is connected with as well. So the idea being that we don't duplicate storage of information, but that information is accessible in an Arctic context as well. One of the big issues that we're focusing on now in the coming year is we're arranging the second Arctic Biodiversity Congress. And at this Congress, it'll be held in conjunction with an Arctic Environment Ministers meeting. I don't know who the Environment Minister is yet in Iceland. And I would encourage people that it would be great to see some participation from Havro in that process. And I know the freshwater work will be presented there, as will a range of other different activities within CAFF. So I know we have quite a short time today, so I just wanted to very quickly run over the freshwater and marine work, because I see those as two areas that are perhaps most relevant for your institute. But there are a range of other activities as well. For example, we're working on a project on resilience of wetlands across the Arctic. We're working on issues to do with marine mammals and bearded seals. So there's a whole range of connections that could potentially exist between your institute and not just my working group, but the other working groups within the Council. And as I said, with Iceland taking the chairmanship of the Arctic Council now in a little under a year and a half, there's going to be an increased focus and emphasis on having engagement between the different institutes within Iceland. And there's also going to be a huge increase in the number of Arctic science-related workshops and conferences held here in Iceland. We're planning, for example, one on marine litter in the summer in Akureyri, which is probably something that your institute would touch upon as well. There's also another big focus within CAFF at the moment, or the Arctic Council, at looking at invasive alien species. So we've just, in May this year, released a strategy and action plan for how to combat or work or address alien species in Arctic areas, and we're now starting to consider how we're actually going to make that action plan a reality. And again, we're planning a workshop here in Iceland sometime in May to look at those issues. So if anyone has any interest after the talk and following up with me and seeing where there are different issues that you might be interested in, then I'm happy to stay and chat. And if there's anything I missed about freshwater, then please jump out and let me know. But I'd like to spend most of the time, if there's questions about the different things that we're working on, if there's issues that you want to raise, or I don't know how familiar people here are with the Arctic Council's working groups. So this is an opportunity to ask, so fire away. So, ja, this is a strange room because some people I can see, and then you've got these big pillars in the center. I can hear you fine. Here you go. Another foreign person here is good.
Yeah. Anyway, I was wondering why the freshwater data is so much better, in so much better shape, like collected and available versus the other data sets.
I think it reflects the nature of the topic as well, because within the marine plan, it was the first plan that we attempted, so it was very ambitious. And a lot of the information that we managed to access was disaggregated, so it was quite challenging to pull it together into circumpolar layers and to understand what's happening. Whereas with the freshwater, it's a more sort of concise, focused group, and they've taken a slightly different approach. They've collecting data sets for the Nordic countries, for the Americas, and then combining them together. So they're not taking the approach within the marine plan where we had like 6 expert networks, and under those lots of different subgroups, so it was quite a complex challenge there. But what we're in the process of doing now that we've released this report is that we're working to try and make sure that those graphics that I showed and that information that lies behind that can be updated on an annual basis and hopefully then expanded to be more comprehensive.
So in that case, would you have a similar scenario where all the data are collected in one location, like the freshwater, or would you have it so that it's sort of linked to the data sources?
All of the information collected for this marine report is available on this Arctic Biodiversity Data Service, but they're in a disaggregated form, so as discrete data sets depending upon the topic at hand. Whereas with the freshwater, it will be one concise database. But the intention and the goal is to try and somehow better harmonize this type of information so that if you're coming to look at this report in 5 years' time, that you can say, okay, well, let's take a look and we can repeat it in a relatively easy way, or we can work backwards to see how they made those assumptions that they did. Silence is always good if there's no other questions. But with regards to the marine work, I'm interested to hear more about Havro and how we can connect our work to what you're doing as well, because there's an increasing focus within CAFF. Oh, yeah, yes, yeah.
So what has happened in that group?
Mm. Yeah.
Also Russia, Alaska,
Yeah.
US, Canada. We applied for specific funding to the Arctic Ministry Council.
Yeah.
That funding was from the state
Yeah.
government. So it's possible to use this platform to work
Yeah.
for
Yeah, that's a very good example how based upon this platform, all those countries are now coordinating about standardizing, I think it's collection of information on trawls and things like that, and it's a real example of how that area can benefit from this. So we're always trying to move it a little bit further ahead.
But the data sets from that is very different.
Yeah. And also when it comes to some countries to allow access to that information and allow it to be shared, because that sometimes is a challenge too. We like to have the policy or the approach that wherever possible information collected, as taxpayers somewhere are paying for it, it should be openly accessible so other people can use it as well. And we're seeing an increasing number of scientists wish to participate in the work that we're doing because they see it as an advantage or a possibility that their work might actually impact and result in some small change, as opposed to disappearing into a peer-reviewed journal somewhere that a limited number of people look at. So there's increasingly scientists coming to us and trying to see, okay, how can our work make a difference? And which is why we start to try and have, peer-reviewed journal special issues in each report to try and make sure that people participating can benefit as well.
For the coastal scenario,
Yeah.
you said that the reason why it's a bit behind the others is because it's sort of meant to be because that's where people live and
Yeah.
operate. Are you collecting? Well, I guess it's a bit outside. Is there any connection to economic data that's collected on the coastal communities?
No, we haven't. We've been focusing purely on biodiversity. But what we have been doing is that there's a huge emphasis within the Arctic Council to include indigenous or traditional knowledge in the work that we do. So the coastal group, its big challenge is how does it use those two different knowledge streams to inform what's happening. So, but knowledge that's related to biodiversity or the environment as opposed to socioeconomic factors. Although there is an increasing push within the Arctic Council and the Arctic states as well that we try to look at this in a more integrated way. So I see when people are searching for funding that their requirements are saying it's great you're looking at biodiversity, but how do you link that to socioeconomic factors? So it's something that we need to consider.
Is there any comparable working group or
There is a working group called the Sustainable Development Working Group, or SDWG, and there they start to look at human development, societal indicators and things like that. But so far, there's been challenging in how to link those things together. There was an effort made now where they looked at the Baffin Bay, the Baltic Sea and other areas to try and conduct large aggregated assessments where they looked at everything, but they're huge undertakings. And it's a challenge, but that's something that we need to address. And within our group, we've started to look at linguistic diversity indicators and aspects like that to try and link in more social issues into what we're doing. But it's a gap and something we need to sort of find a way to address. Okay, so everyone knows everything about the Arctic now. Well, as I said, I live here in Auckland in Iceland, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to give me a shout. If anyone is inspired to participate in Arctic Council-related things, whether it's in the group I'm in or wherever, give me a shout and I can always point you in the right direction. Our next big report that will connect to your institute, of course, will be our State of the Environment Freshwater report, which will be delivered to an Arctic Environmental Ministers meeting probably in 2019. And that's going to be quite a significant report as well, because it's the first sort of really major report that will be looking at biodiversity in freshwater areas in the Arctic Council, at least that I'm aware of. So it's going to be quite a big focus on us for the coming year or so. Sorry. Oh yeah. Yeah, Tom. It's very easy. Tom at CAFF. Yeah. It's one of those things in Iceland, you know. It's great. Everything is first name. So. Although there's I teach a little bit in the University of Auckland, and there's another guy there, an Irish guy as well, happened to be from the same town as me, and his name was Tim. And I knew him, and he had an account in the cafeteria, and they kept putting my meals on his name, so I was very, very happy about it. Anyway, that's nothing to do with biodiversity, but there you go. Okay, thank you.